All right, we are on. Okay, so you guys have me for the first hour and a half. Then you have me for the next hour and a half. Then you get Brian. Then you get me again for an hour and a half. Okay, that's Brian. He is my cohort in this, my co-conspirator. Okay, so you probably are wondering, does anybody know what that is? What is that? That's the flying spaghetti monster, the great illusion that Richard Dawkins talks about, that believing in God is like believing in the flying spaghetti monster, or disproving. We won't get into that. Everybody know who that is? Jesus. It's actually in his triumphant. And ironically, those are true stained glasses that are in churches. There are atheist churches. I don't know if you guys knew that. Very interesting concept, but there are atheist churches. The two chairs at the top. Is anybody in here familiar with Francis Schaeffer? Okay, Francis Schaeffer had this idea, and he said, you really cannot evaluate somebody's worldview unless you sit in their chair, and you look at the world around you based on their assumptions, okay? And so you'll see that as we go through this, I think it's a great way, both we're going to learn to interact. If you're going on the trip and you're going to do the training, you're going to learn how to interact this way. A lot of the times we will use the arguments of the atheists to prove our own points, assuming their assumptions, okay? So what he basically said, and the reason that I use that analogy as well is because I have truly sat in both chairs from a perspective where I thought was true to reality. Okay, so again, I think most everybody knows me. My name is Scott Mauser. I work for the organization called Alpha Omega Institute. We already did a couple of the housekeeping items when it comes to the facility here. Do feel free to get up and move. Don't do it like every 5 minutes and become a distraction. But if you need to use the bathroom or do something, go for it, okay? If you want to grab something to drink, anything of that nature, go for it, okay? Just wear a mask if you have it, and just make sure you're not fingering everything, okay? So, but we are going to do some housekeeping items when it comes to the talk. I actually give this talk in high schools. I give it at Grand Junction High School. I also give it at Fruta. I'm looking at now putting it in Palisade. I'm working with a teacher out there. We are in an age where truth seems to have lost its meaning. And so the first thing you need to do when we start talking about something is we need to make sure our terms are the same. So truth decay. In 2016, the Oxford Dictionary said its word of the year was post-truth. It says relating or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. Just look at our cancel culture nowadays. A lot of the times you can't even get in there to make an argument. And so you have to be careful. But we are in an area where truth seems to be relative. Well, I'm coming from a point, if you guys start getting a really bad odor, let me know. I did put on deodorant, but it'll kind of wave. Just kidding. Okay, so here, what I want to do. Does anybody in here speak Dutch? No. Okay, this gentleman over here, his name is Soren Kierkegaard. It's from a book called Works of Love. He's an 18th century philosopher. He's what they called a Christian existentialist. But when an author writes something, and you'll hear this sometimes in critical theory, you'll hear that, well, it's up to us to decide what it means, correct? That's bunk, okay? The author had an intention, okay? Well, say I don't speak Dutch, and I want to figure out what it says, because the author is trying to communicate to me. The author is trying to tell me something that he feels is important. And so it has to come across. So what do we do when we don't understand a language? We go to Google Translate. How many of you guys use Google Translate a lot? I've had some fun experiences with that. I remember one time I looked up glasses in German, because we have a German family that goes here, and she was umpiring, or she was reffing one of the volleyball games. And so she had made what I thought was a bad call. So I looked up in Google, and I said, glasses. And so I yelled at her in German. She just started laughing. What I found out is it wasn't eyeglasses, they were shot glasses, I told her. So you got to be careful with those Google Translate. But I go to Google Translate one day, and there's a glitch. And so Google Translate tells me that Dutch actually says this: The universe we observe has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, if you're astute, you would probably say, well, if Kierkegaard is from the 19th century, the 1800s, they didn't know about DNA, so something must be wrong here. This is actually a quote by Richard Dawkins. Really, what the translation of that is, it says, indeed, one can be deceived in many ways. One can be deceived in believing what is untrue, but on the other hand, one is also deceived in not believing what is true. Okay? That's the position we're all in. Okay, we need to find out what's true to reality, and true in the sense that we're going through right here. So a lot of the times when I deal with people, especially in regards to the Bible, I have to deconstruct what they think they know about Christianity. We had a speaker one time, or one of our fellow members at AOI was doing a talk, and an atheist got up, and he basically said, I can't believe in a book that tells me that the world is on the back of a turtle. And our speaker said, well, I wouldn't either. Wasn't that what you believe? No, that's not what we believe. So we need to understand, and when I go and talk to people, I said, you need to understand what Christianity is, not how it's practiced. I said, a lot of people who call themselves Christians have no idea what they believe. Okay? We need to find out what is true. Okay? So it's interesting. We're going to talk more about this book later. But this author wrote a book, and primarily because she saw what her culture, she's a millennial, she says what worries us in the writing of this book is how easily we can be fooled into accepting as truth something we like to hear but in reality is harmful, while rejecting what sounds uncomfortable but is really for our good. You guys, reality is hard sometimes. Think about insulin. You think about insulin if you're a type 1 diabetic, and if truth was relative, then you could go into your doctor and say, you know what, doc, yeah, I know you say insulin is what I need, but I like ice cream. So I'm going to use ice cream as my cure. What's going to happen? They're going to die. They're going to probably go into a diabetic coma and die. So when I talk about truth, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about truth like gravity. That if you saw a line of people that were walking over a cliff, all thinking they could fly, hopefully would somebody put up a sign and say, hey, you know, this is not working the way you would like it to work. This is the kind of truth. We need to know what is true to reality, because no one wants to end their life living a lie. So we're going to show you something here I think you'll like. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. This gentleman's name is Felix Baumgardner. I'm going to use it as an analogy for life and understanding the difficulty and sometimes the hardships in finding out what is true, but the necessity of doing it. At this time, it's been broken since then, but he was jumping from 128,000 feet. He is the first person to go over Mach 1 outside of a vessel. Okay? He was going pretty fast. So we're going to watch this really quick. As you watch this, kind of think of it as an analogy for life. Think about what had to go into the preparation of him doing this. How many scientists, how many engineers, how many people had to know and look at physical reality, know its constraints, to make sure that he didn't die in the process. As you probably know, if you jump off a two-story building, it's probably going to kill you when you fall. Try 128,000 feet. He's telling him, he's asking him, he says, I wish you could see what I see. And they're telling him, they're taking him through definite steps. Detach this, make sure this is activated, blah, 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 before he jumps. Now that's a heavy-duty GoPro. Has anybody seen these Red Bull jumps before? Dude. How many have skydived in here? No one? Okay. Pretty freaky, isn't it? That first step. So I can imagine right now things are pretty surreal. He's pretty stable. He's going down. He's in the atmosphere, but it's the stratosphere, so he's in the highest portion. Pretty amazing. Imagine what his mind is thinking. Huh? He's actually working. He's doing an experimental suit. So he's working with people like Elon Musk and NASA. I mean, a lot of smart people had to go into this. What you're going to see, though, if you know or if you've ever been skydiving, when you have the atmosphere around you, you can get into uncontrollable spins, and you have to put your arms out. But there's not enough atmosphere for him to actually stop spinning. So you're going to see in a second, so if you get seasick or motion sick, don't throw up on the table, okay? There's a couple of times where they try to communicate with him and they can't understand what he's saying. So almost like an oxygen deprivation. And you'll see as he starts spinning. He actually, in the middle of the spin, he says, I can't control it. So right now he just broke the sound barrier. He gets up to 972 miles per hour free fall. During the spin, this is where they can't understand. They're saying on the comm, they're saying, does anybody understand what he's saying? Finally, when they talk to him, he says, I am in a spin, I'm going to pass out. What do you think happens if he passes out? It's a little hard to pull the chute. Now, I don't know in the device if he actually has something to activate the chute, if he would pass out. And if he throws up, it's really bad. Then he stabilizes again. He's reduced in speed. He's now going, between 200 and 300 miles an hour. Still, he's hauling. But obviously, when you get into the denser atmosphere, he's able to stabilize himself. It actually took 4.5 minutes of free fall to get back down to Earth. He deploys his parachute at about 8,000 feet and then coasts in the rest of the way. So he free fell about 120,000 feet. Yep. When he made this jump, he was trusting a lot of people in their mathematical computations, in maybe the strength of the material that he was wearing, because when you start going Mach 1, you generate friction. Friction generates heat, okay? So basically, as he's coming down, was his parachute packed correctly? Something as simple as that. Is it going to take the velocity that he's falling at, okay? Will all the mechanisms work, okay? And thus, there he is, safely. He actually says during the fall at one time, he says, I can't believe I made it, okay? When we think about what is true, when you think about life, it doesn't matter what you believe unless what you believe intersects with what is really real, okay? You don't want to live a life based on a lie, and it's your responsibility to figure out what it is, okay? You'll see as we go through this. So when I talk about truth, this is the kind of truth I'm talking about. There are going to be difficult times. In his first part of the free fall, as he's falling, it's beautiful. Life is easy. But then the spins come, the descent comes, difficulties come. And how do you deal with those based on what you know is true? He had to rely on what was true about the physical world. Now I don't know Felix, I hope he was prepared for if the physical things broke down, if he was prepared for the spiritual world. I don't know. I don't know Felix, but are you prepared for the ride as well as the arrival or the departure? Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is what is called confidence versus arrogance. People a lot of the times think if you speak confidently on things that you're arrogant. And so I want to make sure that we understand there are things we can be confident about. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay? There's an infinite number of wrong answers, but I can be confident in the right answer. H2O is water, E = mc². We have other mathematical computations, we have scientific theorems, things of that nature, and we can know history from eyewitness accounts. Okay? If somebody says that George Washington was the first president and Abraham Lincoln was the 16th, that's not arrogant. That's confident, if you know. Okay? If I come off as arrogant, and I hope I don't, I'm sorry. Okay? That's not my intention. I am very confident in the worldview that I hold because I've tested it years and years and years because I do want to believe what's true to reality. I tell my kiddos all the time and I tell my students, if Christianity is not true, do not believe it. Don't. C.S. Lewis made a quote, and we went over it in class just the other day. He said, if Christianity is not true, it's of no value. None whatsoever. It's a lie about reality. You should discard it. But if it's true, it's of infinite importance. It's of infinite importance, okay? And you need to look at that. We even have, so if I do come off as arrogant, I hope that's not the case, and I don't think I will, but I hope you fight against ideas and not people, okay? We're called to fight ideas. We're not called to go against people. Everybody's made in the image of God, okay? And even atheists. This is Christopher Hitchens. He wrote God is Not Great. And he says, I have been called arrogant myself in a time, and I hope to earn the title again. But to claim that I am privy to the secrets of the universe and its creator, that's even beyond my conceit. Is it conceit or is it confidence? Can we know that God exists? And I believe we can, confidently. Okay? So those are some of the things that I just wanted to get out of the way. Okay? Any questions on that part? Nope? You guys are all still awake. It's good. It's only like 9:30. We're going good. Okay? So for me, I was raised in the church. Okay? But I've also got a very philosophical mind and I have a very scientific mind. Actually, my oldest sister, went to Paris to study. And she studied French literature and sociology, and if you know either, you know there's a lot of atheists in both. And so she sent me a lot of literature, or referenced books for me that I started reading at a very young age. I started reading people like Kafka and Camus and Nietzsche when I was 12 and 13. It's not real healthy reading if you don't have somebody guiding you, okay? But what I was starting to find out is I was in middle school and going into high school in this, that I was wondering, is my belief a lie? Because what I was learning was saying that there was some difficulties there. So really for me, it was a conflict between science and religion. Because at church, I was reading, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but in school, I was learning that no God was needed, no God was there, that it happened materialistically, and these things came into existence without any aid from God through what we call the Big Bang. The pivotal or the primary point in my faith is the death and resurrection of Christ. But according to science, dead men don't rise. Okay? Once you're dead, you're gone. You become worm fodder. Okay? I also believed that in the beginning, mankind started with two people, that we are all genetically related, and science is doing some amazing things in that area in regards to what they call Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve. They're actually showing that the Bible is correct. But anyways, I didn't know anything at that time. And so, but in school, I was learning that everything came through death and decay, that it was accidental, and that actually we were the result, or we were standing on top of a huge pile of things that had to die for us to get here. So it really wasn't good in the beginning. And so for me, it truly was a conflict between science and religion. My identity was based in who I thought I was, made in the image of God. But if you take God away, it really destroys your image. No joke. Worse than a bad hair day. But what I started seeing is, was my faith a God of the gaps? Was I just plugging God in? And you'll hear this from a lot of atheists. Was I just plugging God in to those points that I didn't have an answer yet, that science hadn't solved the riddle yet? You guys don't know this guy. His name, does anybody know who he is? Yep. Carl Sagan. When I was in high school, you guys know more Neil deGrasse Tyson. Okay? He did the first Cosmos series, and he says the cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be. Doesn't it sound a little biblical? like maybe he's playing off of what Christ said about himself. But anyways, I started reading many atheists. Richard Dawkins became someone that I read quite a bit. I love his shirt, "Religion, Together We Can Find a Cure." Okay? So you can see that what I started doing is I didn't read what Christians were saying about these. I went straight to the source. And so I was reading atheist material, I was reading skeptical material, and I really didn't have a framework to be able to understand it. Okay? So what I started doing is I started going to my elders in my church. And my elders were giving me no answers. I didn't hear the "you just need to believe it" kind of thing, but so it wasn't that bad, but they had no answers. They said, "We don't know, Scott. It does seem that science seems to be telling us about reality and things seem to be wrong with the Bible. But we know it's not true, we just don't know how." Well, that didn't satisfy my mind. And if I look at it, 160 years, since the writing of Darwin's book in 1859, when we look at that, was he true? It's interesting because you're going to be taught it's fact. I was taught it was fact. But this is actually from one of his journals. And if you look up there, it says, "I think." And I always thought that it was proven. I thought Darwin, yeah, he didn't have all the pieces in place, but yet now we know these pieces. And no. But I wasn't told that. I was never given the other side of the story. Okay? And so I started evaluating everything from a naturalistic standpoint. I said, well, if naturalism is true, what kind of effect does that have on what I believe? And so I started analyzing the Bible. I don't know if you've heard of Thomas Jefferson's Bible. Thomas Jefferson cut out all the miracles. Okay? His Bible is free from all miracles. He thought it was a moral tract, more so. He was a deist, so he didn't absolutely deny the existence of a God, but he did not believe that God intervened. So at this time, this book was not written. This book is called Darwin's Dangerous Idea by Daniel Dennett. He is an atheist. He's a professor. But this kind of distills, or it brings the ideas together that I was fighting with. Because, okay, because, yeah, I was like, whoa. You guys know, even if you don't know the law of non-contradiction, you know that both creation from nothing with no God and creation by God can't both be true, right? Even if you don't know the reason. So he goes on and he says, if I were to give an award for the single best idea anyone ever had, I'd give it to Darwin. Ahead of Einstein, ahead of Newton, all these brilliant minds. In a single stroke, the idea of evolution by natural selection unifies the realm of life, meaning and purpose with the realm of space and time, cause and effect, mechanism and physical law. It is the foundation for everything. The origin story within every worldview, no matter what worldview you have, has to explain everything we experience that we know and we understand. He puts forth an analogy, and he says universal acid says is so corrosive it will eat through anything. The problem is, what do you keep it in? Little did I realize that in a few years I would encounter an idea, Darwin's idea, bearing an unmistakable likeness to universal acid. He says it threatened to leak out, offering answers, welcome or not, to everything. That's why we have evolutionary psychology, evolutionary philosophy. We have these things. It's an all-encompassing worldview. Nothing is left out. I also started reading different philosophers. This is David Hume. He's considered one of the greatest skeptics. But this came at the end of his books. And it really kind of made me feel that my belief in God was not just irrational, but it was silly. It was stupid. It made me a fool. He goes in and he says, if we take in our hand any book of divinity or theology or any school of metaphysics or things outside of the physical world, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning, like pure logic, okay? Does it, or concerning quality or number, pure mathematics? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning, meaning, can I feel it, touch it, can I put it in a Bunsen burner? Basically, he says no. He says, then commit it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry, which is deception and illusion. Obviously, the Bible wasn't that. Now, I wasn't a good enough thinker at this time to realize that his own statement doesn't adhere to that, so it's a self-defeating statement, so he contradicts himself. But I wasn't taught to think, okay? And so he was basically saying if it's not scientifically testable, it's not knowledge. Well, I don't know how many of you test the things in your Bible. I mean, historically tested, things of that nature. But again, I was not getting the help I needed to be able to evaluate the information that I was getting. I had a little buddy Jesus, is what I felt like, okay? I had a guy there that was kind of here to boost me up and make me feel good, but really I was seeing that he was becoming more and more foolish. Ironically, in this same book, not to leave you with that, he basically says, I won't read the quote to you, but he basically says, I can't live this way. When I go play backgammon or I'm sitting with my friends, I don't really believe this stuff I'm writing because it's unlivable. If it's unlivable, is it true to reality? Okay, but again, I was not in a position where I'd been taught to think. School, unfortunately, in most places, tells you what to think, not how to think, okay? So I felt that I was finally lifting up the curtain, and I was seeing that reality was quite different. You know, the Truman Show was not out, but I think it would have been a good allegory for me, that my whole life I felt had been a lie. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a position where everything you held dear to you all of a sudden is taken away, okay? It's pretty harsh. So of course I left the church. Now I didn't physically leave the church, and you'll see in another talk I give later, most people either gain or leave their faith by the age of 11, okay? We're gonna see his mass exodus of the church, okay? I didn't leave the church because I loved my parents, still love my parents, and so I stayed going to church. They had no idea, okay? I found out, or what I thought, that my belief was a lie. It was not true to reality, okay? And so what I needed to do, kind of, when everything is taken away from you, you do feel like you're in a wasteland. I don't know if you guys have ever read T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, great poem. But anyways, I felt that I was completely without any anchors, any hope. I didn't know what was true. And so I started looking, but I was looking in all the wrong places. This gentleman, his name is Aldous Huxley. He's the one that initially got me into drugs. He wrote a book called The Doors of Perception. He also wrote a book called Heaven and Hell. And they were basically on mescaline trips. He basically took peyote and wrote. He was a pantheist. He believed that God was kind of in things. I was searching at everything. I was reading anything I could find my hands. I wanted to find out was true because I really didn't want naturalism to be true. Got into books by Carlos Castaneda and others. But I like his quote. He says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks in his cavern. Similar to Plato's cave analogy. But I thought, well, maybe I'm just seeing, little bits. I need to study more. I need to find out what is true to reality. So many of you, this is not the road you go because you're not readers. I'm a reader. So these are some of the books that were formulating me as a young individual, but with no one to help me to understand the thoughts. Machiavelli, The Prince, most of you will read that in high school. Okay, The Antichrist by Frederick Nietzsche. I read a lot of Nietzsche. Thus Spake Zarathustra. Okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I even went into some of the Eastern religions. This is one of the first books I read. It's always an upbeat book called Madness and Civilization by a guy by the name of Michel Foucault. Okay, but these are the books that I started reading. Communist Manifesto, Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea. It's a book about a guy that every time he comes in contact with reality, it makes him want to vomit because it is so absurd. It is so irrational that he just does not want to live it. Mein Kampf, I got into, if anybody knows Aleister Crowley, anybody Ozzy Osbourne fan? He sings about him. Okay, Aleister Crowley was part of a group called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. They did tantric magic. Okay, so I was reading everything. Waiting for Godot. It's a book about two guys that are waiting for this person named Godot, but Godot never shows up. It's an analogy of God not really being there, even though we think he is. Okay? Kafka's The Trial. In the very beginning of the book, they rush into his house. He is pulled away for a crime. He is put on trial for the crime. He is convicted of the crime, and he is killed for the crime, and he never finds out what his crime was. That's how he felt about life. So this is what was forming me. Okay? Now, you guys, it's a lot different. This book was especially poignant for me. It's by an author by the name of Goethe. It's called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And in the end, the protagonist ends up committing suicide. Okay? At the age of 16, I got my first tattoo. And it is an ankh, which ironically is a symbol for eternal life. But it looks like a gravestone, and across it, it says Werther. I, at the age of 16, thought that this was my destiny. that I would end up committing suicide because I was not finding anything that would persuade me that naturalism wasn't true. Now, you guys, it's different. You have YouTube. I don't know if many of you have watched The Black Mirror, okay? Pretty intense. It's like a dark, dark version of The Twilight Zone. But it really brings up ideas and stuff, if this is a naturalistic world, what the consequences. What are you guys watching on YouTube, though? Things of that nature. So where did that leave me? I had no idea what to do with my fear, my guilt, my shame. What was love? I felt guilt. I was afraid of things. But yet if the naturalistic worldview was true, how did I deal with any of them? So it was constant anxiety. So what do you do when you have no clue? You go to Europe. That's what I did. I went as a foreign exchange student to Finland. I was in Finland for 10 months. If you know anything about Finland at that time, it was the most developed country with the highest suicide rate. Wasn't a good place for me. A lot of it is because of seasonal affective disorder, because the sun during the winter months only comes up for about 30 minutes and then goes back down depending on where you are in Finland, okay? So I knew I had to come back to the States, and so I decided when I came back to the States, I was accepted at 2 universities, Colorado School of Mines, I was gonna study chemical engineering, or Colorado College, looking at comparative religion and philosophy. I had scholarships to the School of Mines, I didn't for Colorado College. And to my parents' chagrin, I chose Colorado College in Colorado Springs. Goes on a block program, it's a fantastic school. But what happened one time, it was the end of our first term, I was in a comparative religion class. And I had a friend that was studying political science. He went to Mexico. He actually did, I'm surprised he didn't die, he actually did research on elections in Mexico, which is not a good thing to do. But he had herbs from Mexico, and one of them was an herb called ganik. Had similar attributes to marijuana. Well, I had an allergic reaction, so I was in Better Health Center for a week hallucinating. I knew I was hallucinating, but what does a college do when you have a student that's hallucinating in your health center for a week? Do you think you say, you're fine? No, you say, I think you need a psychological evaluation. They asked that I had a psychological evaluation. Now, at this time, I was done with school. My philosophy had undergirded that, why go to school? If everything is for nothing, why not basically live it up? Die young, whatever may be the case. So I went to the next best place. I went to San Francisco. Not a good place to go if you're confused either. Okay, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Grateful Dead. This is a book Tom Wolfe wrote called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. In all of their concerts, they would put acid in the drink, okay? My preferred drugs were hallucinogens. I was not into feeling 10-foot tall and bulletproof. I like to see things. I originally got into them, like I said, because of the books, Heaven and Hell, and because he felt, and a lot of people felt, that you could expand your consciousness in your mind, even though I didn't believe that consciousness existed because of, but anyways, I was confused, very confused, okay? Well, what ended up happening to me, what ended up happening to me is that I went down, I'd been up for about 48 hours. This was about the first time I had tried crank, okay? So I'd been up for about 2 days, and we knew how to get down. I had some friends that we knew how to sneak into the private beaches that were privately owned down in Monterey. And so I had gone down because I love the ocean, and I'd sit and watch the ocean. Well, what happened is I started feeling a little, not like myself, really, that's hard to believe since I was always on something. But my throat started to constrict, and I started to get tunnel vision. I said, I just need to get some sleep. Well, I ended up in a town called Salinas, and the tunnel vision was so bad, I knew that I had overdosed, that something was happening and I needed help. I went into a little mom and pop stand, a little hamburger joint. I sat down and I said, I'm sorry, but I think I'm overdosing. And ended up, I was taken by ambulance to the hospital in Salinas. And they told me that I was not too far from renal failure and some other problems. And so I was basically at that bottom point. I lived in Northern California. If you've been up there, the cliffs at Pacifica are amazing, okay? But I got to the point where I felt that I had no ability, that if I went to Pacifica, I would not be able to stop myself from throwing myself off a cliff, okay? Because if what I believed was true, and the pain I was going through, and the life that I was living, it gave me no hope. I became focused on one thought from my readings. It's by a gentleman by the name of Albert Camus. It was from a book called The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a man that was cursed by God to forever roll a boulder up a hill just for it to roll back down. His life was meaningless. The act had no meaning, and even when it was accomplished, it was futile. And in Camus, he wrote a portion or an essay called An Absurd Reasoning. And he says, basically in that book, there's but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. And so here, I had absolutely no hope. Now, this was from one of the books that I had read. And I initially came across this idea in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, but it originally came out of his book called The Unconscious God. He was considered the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, and he came up with a simple equation. He said, wherever there is suffering, and there's absolutely no meaning to it, it always ends in despair. He said, I discovered this at my third concentration camp at Auschwitz. He actually lost his entire family to the things that were happening in Germany. So I was basically at this point. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that's not the inevitable end of naturalism. And I said, well, yeah, some people don't think through it, but I did. And here is the end. Remember, I told you the very beginning of that essay, he talked about the philosophical question being suicide. And he said, at the very end, now tell me if you think this sounds hopeful. The absurd man thus catches sight of a burning and frigid, transparent and limited universe in which nothing is possible but everything is given, and beyond which all is collapse and nothingness. He can then decide to accept such a universe and draw from it his strength, his refusal to hope, and the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. Pretty upbeat, huh? This was the thoughts that I was having. So what happened, this equation basically, because I was raised a Christian. I was raised in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And so I ended up committing myself to what is called El Camino Hospital in Mountain View, California. It's one of their campuses, okay? I was in an 8-week lockdown program for chemical abuse, things of that nature. Well, what they did is they sent in every psychologist, but every psychologist they had was an evolutionary psychologist. They were not Christian, and so their reasoning and their rationale gave me no hope. I had taken it to their limits. Finally, you can tell, now this actually came from a good friend who was trying to encourage me, but you can tell I didn't have a lot of support. They actually didn't let her bring it in though. They came in and she said, what do you have? Oh, I have a movie and some cards for him. And the cards were Looney Tune cards. But you can see that I didn't have a lot of support of working through the issues. It was more, don't worry about it, you're gonna get through this. Finally, they said, we've got a priest. We had talked to a priest. This was a Catholic priest. And I said, you know what, I'm in here for 8 weeks. They knew, because I had told them, I said, if you can't give me an understanding or help me to find some reason to live, I just don't see the point. I had made a mess of my life, okay? And it was interesting because he was versed in what was called apologetics. It was the first time I had ever heard the word, okay? It comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a legal defense, okay? It's actually a branch of theology that is dedicated to defending the Christian faith against other worldviews. So it's a sub-branch of theology. He was versed in this. And he said, hold on there a second. He asked me, he actually sat down and listened to me. And he must have read Francis Schaeffer, because Francis Schaeffer said, if I ever come in contact with an unbeliever and I only have an hour, he said, first 55 minutes I'll listen to them. The last 5 minutes I'll give them advice or tell them about the gospel, because you get to know the person. So he listened and he said, so why do you believe there's no hope? Why do you believe this? And so I was giving him all my evidences. I felt so good, you know. I was a very proud person as well. And he said, I don't think you've been told everything. I said, I haven't been told everything. I put this verse in here because this is actually the point where God started bringing me back. I actually reached out to God. And I said, God, I don't know if any of you have been in a point so dark that you thought the only way out was suicide. It is a scary place. And so I put this in here. That is what's called the Tel Dan Inscription, because I want to tell people, especially when I'm in the high schools, this is an inscription from 8 to 900 BC, 8th and 9th, or 9th and 10th century BC. And it tells about the house of David. So many times people said David didn't exist. Things like that didn't exist. We have so much proof for the Christian faith. But this comes out of the Psalms. He said, some were fools through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities, they suffered affliction. They loathed any kind of food, and they drew near to the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He sent out his word, and he healed them, and he delivered them from their destruction. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, to his wondrous works to the children of man, and let them offer sacrifices of thanksgiving, and tell of his deeds and songs of joy. I really was at that point. Now, what basically this apologist told me is he said, you're looking at the inside of a box. He said, you have a very limited perspective. You're kind of in, he didn't use the term, but we hear it nowadays, you're in an echo chamber. And he started very simply. Now, this comes from a book by J. Warner Wallace, but it's a great diagram that there are many arguments that lead to the existence or show the evidence for the existence of God. The one that he used mostly with me was what is called the cosmological, or the cause and effect argument. First thing he said to me is he said, hey, let me ask you, you're a scientific person. He said, if there was any time in the past where there was nothing, would there be anything today? No. From nothing, nothing comes. He said, you know from your science study that time, space, matter, energy all came into an existence in a point at the beginning of time. Yeah. He said, so the universe can't be eternal, can it? Because it began to exist. I said, no. He said, then something outside of space, outside of time, outside of the material realm has to be the eternal thing. And then he took me in and he said, what about personality? What about free will? Cause and effect relationships. The cause is in the effect. So do you get personality from rocks? Do you get personality from chemicals? So he worked on those. He also talked about the fine-tuning argument, about the design in the world. Now, he didn't know the complexity that we're uncovering now with genetics and epigenetics. And he said, yeah, people will tell you that you can't have direct knowledge of God. People want God to stand right in front of them. Okay? But you can see the effects, similar to the wind. We don't see the wind unless it's carrying something. We see the effects of the wind. We see the bowing down of grass or of wheat and grain, or we see the blowing of the leaves in the tree. But we know that wind exists. Right now, just think of the epidemic that's going on. We don't see the coronavirus unless you see pictures of it. But with our naked eye, we don't see it. There are things that affect, okay? And so he started taking this. So when I got out of the hospital, at least I had a glimmer of hope. I had something to pursue, to see. I wasn't a Christian yet, but I had ideas. I'm like, I need to look into this. This is evidence that I had not been given. So I was wondering, is this just an intellectual problem? And I started looking and I started reading everything that I could get a hold of, both atheist still or non-Christian and Christian. I always, to my parents' or to my wife's chagrin, I subscribe to like the New York Times, as well as the Wall Street Journal, as well as my wife hates that I give, but I do it because I want to hear what they're saying. I don't want to be in an echo chamber, okay? And so I started looking at people like Freud. And there were some great books written. This one is by a gentleman by the name of Paul Vitz. He's actually a psychology professor at NYU. And you guys also, I forgot to tell you, in that packet has the entire, every quote, every book, everything you see on this screen is in that packet. I am so sorry. I saw Caroline writing, and I'm like, ooh, I forgot to tell you. I did it so that you could look, so you could go and reference things. We also put in arguments, general arguments, good reference books that you can go to as well. But anyways, so he wrote a book called Faith of the Fatherless. And what he did is he found out that most of the atheists that he studied, they all had something in common. They hated their father. There was a distaste. And so he came up with this concept of the faulted father. That atheism actually was an emotional response to an aggravated childhood. Similar to what Freud said, things of that nature. But I also looked because one of the things against Christians was hypocrisy. So I started looking and I found a book, is a great book by Paul Johnson. He's a British historian, and it's called Intellectuals. And he goes in and he dissects the life of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Tolstoy and Camus and all these people. And he finds out that, wow, hypocrisy isn't just a Christian thing. It seems like wherever there's people, there's hypocrisy. Okay, and that's why I always say you judge a religion by what it teaches, not what its adherents practice. Okay? Because we are humans. But I started seeing that there were so many more dimensions, not just intellectual dimensions, of why people reject. So the problem of evil came up. Okay? And yes, Pastor Buss, who used to be a pastor here, he was really into technology and Apple, and he had told me he read Steve Jobs' biography, and the reason he left the faith was because he didn't feel he got a sufficient answer for the problem of evil. But there is a problem with the problem of evil, because you need to be able to make choices, right? You have to be able to choose between the good and the bad. You have to have moral accountability, correct? But what we find out is that Christianity teaches that we are the driver. Okay? We can actually direct our thoughts. We have free will. Naturalism and many other philosophies and many other religions do not allow that. You are basically an automaton. You are a machine. Okay? And so I started thinking through things like this. And so atheism looks at and really proposes that, and we're going to get to some quotes in a second, that there is no such thing as free will. Well, how can you ask the question of evil if you can't make a choice? You have a major problem. We're going to talk about it. Now, I apologize. There are two words in this that some of you may not like to hear. They're not the worst words, but it's going to help prove my next point. So, it's from a series called Faulty Towers. Okay, so British humor, whether you like British humor or not, is up to you. But this is interesting because when Richard Dawkins was interviewed, he actually referenced this video. And basically what he said is he said, of course we laugh, Dawkins writes, but why don't we laugh at a judge who punishes a criminal? Doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense the very idea of responsibility? He was saying we were like the car, and it should almost seem as ludicrous. Yet, he's writing to you thinking that you can think on what he's saying and make a choice according to what he's written, but yet he's saying that doesn't really exist. Do you start seeing the contradictions that fall, okay? And he was asked, actually, in an interview in D.C. after that, he says, by the interviewer, he says, but don't you see that as an inconsistency in your view, that you're saying we don't have responsibility, but we need to act responsibly? Dawkins replied, I sort of do, yes, but it is an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. Okay, well, if we have no choice, nothing's going to change, so would it become more intolerable? No, nothing would change. Do you see the problems, how atheism, materialism breaking? This is what I was starting to see. That within the problem of evil, the atheists didn't even have the ability to ask the question because they had no grounds, either for moral choice or for right or wrong, okay? This is Einstein. This is from a book here recently, Isaacson, but I had known of this quote earlier. It said, human beings in their thinking, feeling, and acting are not free, but are causally bound as the stars in their motions. But then again, he says, yet on the other hand, he says, I am compelled to act as free will existed, because if I want to live in a civilized society, I must act responsibly. Is anybody seeing the irrationality in their position? Okay, and that's not it. This is Marvin Minsky. Marvin Minsky was at MIT. He's passed away. He actually started their artificial intelligence laboratory. He's best known for his comment that the brain is nothing more than a 3-pound computer made of meat. okay? But this is what he writes, and it's actually in a grouping of about 270 essays that he does on intelligence, artificial intelligence, things of that nature. But he says, does that mean that we must embrace the modern scientific view and put aside the ancient myth of voluntary choice or free will? No, we can't do that, okay? Why not? Minsky goes on, no matter what the physical world provides, no room. So even though the physical world provides no room for freedom of will, the concept is essential to our models of the mental realm. Okay, it's a lie, but if we don't lie to ourselves, we won't know the truth. Okay? We cannot ever give it up. We're virtually forced to maintain that belief even though we know it's false. Wow. Okay? And these are not believers. Okay? So I started seeing that there were problems. Also, this idea of legend or myth. You know, was Christ just a recycled Messiah? Was he a Mithras, reincarnation? Was he Dionysius? And actually, when I started doing a lot of research on this, Ronald Nash has done a great book, but really the debate was over in the 20s. When they started looking at the evidence, it's like, no. If anything, some of these, because Mithras, actually, most of the stuff we know about it comes after the advent of Christianity. So if anything, it probably is the opposite, but there's not even correlations. Some of their correlations, they'll tell you Mithras was virgin born. He was born out of a rock. Would you call that virgin born? Well, nobody was involved, things of that nature. So you find out, but you can see. And so I saw that there were emotional reasons that people did not want to believe, because I thought the intellectual arguments were very strong. Now, they weren't 100%. We don't have anything 100% except in pure mathematics and pure logic, okay? We do everything by percentages, okay? But it was overwhelmingly. And so I started to see, as I was going through and trying to find out what was true to reality, I started seeing the edifice of what I thought was true start cracking, okay? Saw that there were intellectual reasons, emotional, volitional reasons that we're going to get to in a second. Volitional just means acts of will. I will not have it so, because I don't want it, okay? And then there's also bias. I think nowadays we see a lot of bias because you don't even get the opportunity to talk to them. We are already in the realm of the unbelievable. When I think of volitional reasons, this goes back to my reading of Nietzsche, the Übermensch, which is the overman. He was the man that would stand on the side of Mount Vesuvius even though he knew it was going to blow, shaking his fist at the volcano. He would express his will even though it was futile. He was going to die, okay? And so I love this quote. Thomas Nagel is his name. He's written some great books. He is an atheist. But listen to this quote. He says, in speaking of the fear of religion itself, I speak from experience, being strongly subject to the fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Okay? He wrote a book that we're going to get to in a second called Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle of the book is Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Most Certainly False. He's an atheist philosopher. And what he said is, we can't explain the essentials of life. You scientists need to come up with a better theory because the Christians are kicking our butts. He doesn't say that, but that's what he's implying, okay? He actually does say similar things. But also, this gentleman's name is Richard Lewant, and he's a geneticist from Harvard. Now, let me ask you, if a Christian used this argument that I'm going to show you in just a second, how well would his argument be taken, okay? So, this is, he says, our willingness of the scientific community to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, it's not real good to go against common sense, is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. So almost an evolution of the gaps, okay? In spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. Just-so stories, if you're familiar, are the ones that were written, say, how did the tiger get his stripes? How did the elephants, they're for kids, and they're nonsensical, but they're fun to read, okay? Because we have a prior commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods, it's not that science itself requires that only material causes, okay, somehow compel us to accept material explanation of the world around us, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus for investigation. Simply stated, we won't allow any other options, period. We don't care, don't let the facts confuse us. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What if we came up with an argument and said, I know Christianity is against common sense. I know that it's kind of a leap in the dark. I know that a lot of it sounds like really funny, made-up stories. I know that this, that. Would they take us very seriously? No, but since he's a Harvard geneticist, he can say things like this, okay, and not be laughed at, that he will not allow certain things in. Some of you have seen No Intelligence Allowed. So what is science really about? We're going to take a break here in just a second, a couple of minute break, after I get through this. So actually, I went back and I thought the best thing with what is science really about, I think, comes from the Cosmos series. The problem is if you guys know Alice in Wonderland, I give myself such very good advice, but I very seldom follow it, okay? He has very good advice here, but I'll tell you he doesn't follow it. Okay? So basically he says, because of course, if we can only get knowledge through the scientific method, then all philosophy and all religion doesn't give us knowledge. And so basically he tells us that we were inhabiting some kind of a prison. And that when science came out, how did we escape from the prison? It was the work of generations of searchers who took 5 simple rules to heart. And it's interesting because most of these searchers were Christians who believed in a theistic world, and so they knew that God had imposed order and law on his creation. And so they searched to find it. Question authority. There was a survey that came out in the New Yorker just a couple of days ago, and they asked college professors how many felt that they could talk about controversial issues. 59% said they would not open their mouth on certain issues. Talk about academic freedom, huh? Okay. You will get canceled, you'll get forced out, but question authority. No idea is true just because someone says so, including me. It was struck down in the courts in many states. All that certain groups were trying to do is put a disclaimer in the front of biology textbooks that said there are many people who disagree with Darwinian evolution, many proven scientists. They went to court over it, they wouldn't even allow them to say that. Isn't science about questioning? Yes, but in the schools, you're not allowed to do that, and even in some labs. So, good advice, you should follow it. Think for yourself. Question yourself. Don't believe anything just because you want to. Believing something doesn't make it so. So true. And I think that if they would look at this, because there are many quotes, I don't have them in here, but a lot of the times, Aldous Huxley, when he was writing, he said, I don't believe evolution because the facts are there. He said, I believe the facts will someday come. I'm paraphrasing, not a direct quote. He said, I believe the facts will come. But he says, I like evolution because it allows me to live the political life, the sexual life, and the social life that I want to live. He didn't want the restraints, okay? So don't believe it. Think for yourself. Test ideas with evidence. Okay, it's a favorite idea fails, a well-designed test, it's wrong, get over it. We're going to talk about a guy, he's a geneticist from Cornell that was an evolutionist, became an old earth creationist, became a young earth creationist because of his studies in genetics. He wrote a book and he said, the primary axiom that we increase in knowledge through mutation is wrong. That natural selection can actually select those traits is wrong. And if that falls, everything built upon it falls as well. He followed the evidence where it leads and said, also another thing to note, if you look at your biology textbook, most of the time they prove evolution by analogy. Oh, look, there's changes in the size of finch beaks or in this, that, or the other. Then they give you an analogy. Since little changes happen, big changes can happen. You cannot prove things by analogy. You explain and you help people understand by analogy. But if your only proof is analogy, you got some big problems. You're lacking the evidence. Okay? 4, follow the evidence wherever it leads. If you have no evidence, reserve judgment. That does not happen. How many times do scientists come out and they have to recall things that are put in National Geographic because they said, this is the missing link. Oh, no, it's not a missing link, it's a lemur. Oops, sorry. Okay? because they want it to be true. Okay? And perhaps the most important of all, remember you could be wrong. Have you ever tried to tell a scientist they're wrong? Now, you guys, I hope you know I'm painting with a broad brush. There are many scientists out there. There are many people out there that are very open. Okay, I'm talking more about paradigms or more about the system as a whole. Okay? It's interesting. Science is a way to keep us from fooling ourselves and each other. Science so conceived. Then we start the process over again. True science actually takes blinders off and allows us to interact with the physical world. It's interesting because I'll tell you in another talk that I do, G.K. Chesterton said that the problem with not believing in God is not you don't believe nothing, but that you'll believe anything. In one of Neil deGrasse Tyson's talks at the Isaac Asimov lectures, he says that it's most probably that we live in a computer simulation. You are a computer simulation. If you're a computer simulation, as all computers work, do you have free will? Do you have consciousness? No. So basically he says we are a higher intelligence plaything. Okay? And I can get you that lecture if you would like it. Karl Popper was a philosopher of science, and he went in and he says, if we want to look at something, you can find all kinds of things that support your cause, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. But if you find one defeater, you know that it's wrong. And so he came up with this idea of falsification, and it's much deeper than that, but a brief overview is that if you have an idea and you want to know if it's true, try to falsify it. You don't see that happening in science today. Okay, why don't we take a quick break? Okay, here we go. Okay, so I talked about the NYU philosopher. The NYU philosopher wrote a book. Now, the book's only about 110 pages, but it's pretty technical, intense when it comes to philosophy. But I'll give you some of the quotes from it, but I want you to look at what the subtitle is. Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Okay, again, remember that he is not, Thomas Nagel, he was at NYU, he is no longer there, but political philosophy, he is a brilliant philosopher. Now, obviously, you can tell he's probably not real well liked in some of the parts of his own community, being an atheist and writing against it, but he truly is he's following the evidence where it leads. And he says there are things that cannot be explained from Darwinism. And these are the most important things in life, okay? And so, remember, he does not want a theistic universe. He is the one when we talked about the willful denial of God. So basically, in his book, he says there are concepts he considers unintelligible or irrational, or we will never be able to explain this from a Darwinian perspective. And science is based in knowledge and finding explanations for causes. Well, if science can't, there's a problem, okay? First thing he says is consciousness. Have you ever wondered why, if we're constantly in flux, why our personality remains the same no matter that our body is changing? The conscious awareness of self through your entire life. You are one individual unless you have a defect in your multiple personality. And then as long as your multiple personalities are nice, you could have a good time. But for the most part, you are one individual. How do you account from that from a materialist standpoint? Because it should not be continuous if everything chemically and everything else in your body is changing, okay? He goes on and he says this. He said, but if the mental is not itself merely physical, meaning if there's something immaterial about the mind, about consciousness, about morality, he said, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism depends. He says we're cutting the branch that we're sitting on. We can't even give an account for what we believe because we shouldn't be able to give an account, and it shouldn't be trustworthy anyways. And it's dominoes falling because in a naturalistic worldview, once that first domino falls, the creation of the universe, everything else is just dominoes falling. You cannot get out of that chain reaction, okay? That's why there is no free will. So he said there's no consciousness, there's no intelligibility. Why can we explain almost everything in our universe through mathematics? Why does mathematics have such a fine intelligibility when it comes to science? And think about it. Numbers are abstract. You may have 2 items in front of you, but the number 2 is actually immaterial. There's not like a number 2 floating out that has essence and substance. Okay? If one immaterial thing exists, it disproves naturalism. And that's what he's getting at. Meaning. You cannot have absolute meaning. You cannot have value. You cannot determine right or wrong. And this is interesting. Social justice is not objective. All this stuff that we hear, I talk to people a lot of times and I say, I know within my worldview why oppression is bad. But why in your worldview is oppression bad? Why and who can oppress who, and is it good sometimes? And it's interesting because during the 40s through the 60s, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell, many people, they were atheists, but they were fighting against and they were in anti-war causes. And so people were asking them, what's your basis? Why is this war wrong or this war right? Isn't it just opinion? So really, if it's just opinion, we don't care what you say. You see the problems that they were bringing out. Okay, I love, there's no true or false. This comes from another atheist. His name is John Gray. He taught at the London School of Economics. He wrote a book called Straw Dogs. He's not real well liked in the atheist community either. It says, modern humanism is the faith that through science, humankind can know truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. There's not even a category for truth. There's not a category for fact. Okay? So these are all things, he says, judgments we make every day. Because remember, we have no free will, so are we making judgments? Are we holding people accountable? There are even people who are saying, why do we have prisons? It's just something physically, okay? Are they just brute facts? He ends up, and he says, I find this view, neo-Darwinism, antecedently unbelievable. A heroic triumph of ideological theory over common sense. And I would be willing to bet that the present right-thinking consensus will come to seem laughable in a generation or two. Though, of course, it may be replaced by a new consensus that is just as invalid. The human will to believe is inexhaustible. Okay? So here you see, these are the kind of things that I started to evaluate after that one person started telling me and giving me evidence that maybe the naturalistic worldview was not correct. You know, I saw this. Now, he did not convert till afterwards. Antony Flew was considered the go-to atheist. He was the one that basically substantiated the argument, that basically said that you should presuppose atheism, meaning you don't have to prove atheism. You just assume it's true. Everybody else has the hard work of proving their point. Okay? So he set kind of the groundwork. He was one of the signers of the Communist Manifesto 3. He wrote books on atheism. And in 2003, he wrote a book based on one of the evidences that brought me to faith, the fine-tuning argument, There is a God, how the world's most notorious atheist became or changed his mind. Now, he didn't end up, unfortunately, as far as I know, a Christian. He was more of a deist. He believed that God had to exist because of the certain things that both Thomas Nagel was talking about, but also when the genetic revolution was happening. Okay? We have people, he said, my discovery of the divine has been a pilgrimage of reason and not of faith. This is the geneticist I was telling you about. He is co-inventor of what is called the gene gun, which is looking at putting new genetic information into the cells to change certain things. He came up with a genetic vaccination process. Okay? He is not an idiot. Okay? He is the one that came from atheism to Christianity. So as you see, you have people like Blaise Pascal. He had his conversion story put in, ESPN's texting me. But he had this conversion story pinned to the inside of his jacket. Okay? You have people like C.S. Lewis, said he was the most unhappy atheist in all of England when he converted. You know, people like you wouldn't know, but were instrumental for me. Malcolm Muggeridge was a journalist. Adler came to Christ late in life. He was probably one of the most well-read people. He edited the 100 greatest works of the Western world. Think of Newton. Do you know Newton wrote more on theology than he did on science? Okay? Now, he was a little wacky. But I'm just telling you that his interest, he was a Unitarian. He didn't believe in the Trinity. Then we have Copernicus. Copernicus wanted to be a Lutheran pastor. but he was told to use his skill. This guy I love, Dr. Raymond Damadian. If anybody tells you that a creationist can't do good science, they may want to look him up. He invented the MRI, and he's a six-day creationist, okay? You have other people. We won't go to all of them, but I started to see that there were many people, both who converted from atheism, but also brilliant people that were always Christian. When we look at Johannes Kepler, Kepler said the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Okay? But now, I don't know if you guys have heard this, Seattle Public Schools starting to teach that math is oppressive. So it's no longer the tool that we can use to understand the world. Math is deeply frustrating subject. I bet many of you would agree with that. Deeply frustrating, but Seattle Public Schools are gearing up to accuse math of a litany of more serious crimes: imperialism, dehumanization, and oppression of marginalized persons. Did you think math could do that? Now, I don't want to paint too simply. There are some reasons why they think that, and but it's way overblown, and we can talk about that later. I can give you that article. But basically, now I came to another crossroads, and now, through investigation, I was brought from that point where I was on the edge of my seat. If that man wouldn't have intervened in my life, and I know God sent him, but if it wouldn't have intervened, I would not be here. My Luke would not be here. Things of that nature, okay? You have to know what you believe is true to reality. But why Christianity? 1 Thessalonians 5:21, we're supposed to test everything, hold fast to what is good. Christianity is not a blind faith by any means, okay? I use a series, and you'll learn this in my class, Cold Case Christianity. We talk about abductive reasoning. I take this formulation. There's many different variations of abductive reasoning, or what's called reasoning to the best conclusion. And so when considering two or more closely competing explanations, you consider 5 factors in his explanation of it. He's a cold case homicide detective, so he always relates it back to crime, okay? And so basically, if you're looking at comparing worldviews and comparing ideologies, first, is it feasible? Think about your victim and the person who perpetrated it. If the guy is dead in New York City and the person who's accused of the crime was at the station in the South Pole, do you think he was able to do it? Well, it's not like a Sherlock kind of thing. I don't know if you watched that Sherlock episode where the person was in Europe and killed, but anyways. Okay, but no, it's not feasible. It's impossible. It is not actually able to happen, okay? Usually straightforward, Occam's razor. Will one person, okay? Does one person account for everything that we have and exhaustive? In the sense that if we have 95 pieces of evidence and we have a guy that can answer for 90 of them and we have another guy that can answer for 10 of them, which one's probably the better choice? Okay? Truth must be logical. This is a defeater, and this is what I say. If no worldview can account for reason, but it uses reason to argue its case, it's a defeater. It falsifies, because if you cannot come up with a basis for saying that reason is true, that we can know things true or false, but yet you're arguing for true or false, you don't have a worldview that can explain the world as it is. So are there contradictions? Is it coherent? Okay? And when you add everything up, basically, and this is a real quick overview, when you add it all up, basically at the end you will find out who your killer is. When a suspect meets the 5 criteria, you know you've reached the verdict. When it comes to worldview, when we test worldviews, and there's tests that you can use, you can evaluate, you can see if they're coherent. Do they correspond to reality as we know it? Are they pragmatic in certain senses? Okay? That is why I'm a Christian. Now, many of you are here for the, hopefully going to go through the trip. This is our last group that went to Berkeley. Okay, and that's us. You can see Brian. He's being held up by the crew. We're down at Huntington Beach. Okay? But when we look at that, because we also go to Southern California, we use our surveys and we ask people questions to start getting into those conversations. And so we're going to train you so that you're better able to do that. One thing I want to clear up really quick, because I was talking in a high school class and there was a girl in there who suffered from depression. And they usually write me a letter after my presentation and tell me, if they have problems with it, whatever it may be. And she was very upset with me because she thought I was teaching that if you're a Christian, you should always be happy. And if you're an atheist, you should always be sad. And so if you had atheism inside, the world is dark and dreary and hopeless. And if you are a Christian, everything should be chipper. Okay? We're not that simple. We are enfleshed souls. We are very complicated in that. And holistically, looking at that, there are many things that affect how we view life. Now, I do believe rationally that atheism leads to an idea called nihilism, which is nothing, hopelessness, okay? If you like meaning in your life. If you don't like meaning and purpose in your life, it's pretty good, okay? I myself fight with severe depression. Part of it is because of my drug use in the past. I think I screwed up my body pretty bad, you know? But also I've always dealt with it. So I at times have been on medications to help me because it is that bad. So I know that my faith is true. I know it even if I don't feel the warm fuzzies, because it's true to reality, okay? So, very complex. So I usually give 3 challenges when I talk to people, going back, and this comes out not what you think. So if you're a Bible reader, okay, and this is someone who's regularly engaging with their Bible, it's an essential part of their life, start wrestling with difficult questions. Maybe start reading people who disagree with you and finding answers. Because if the Bible is true, it will hold up to scrutiny, which I believe it is, okay? Poke and prod, okay? Have a proper skepticism, okay? Proper skepticism means you ask questions. You look at the claims, you test the claims, you evaluate. But you can come to conclusions. You don't always have to be a skeptic, okay? You don't always have to be a skeptic that George Washington is the first president. You have a lot of good evidence. You can close out on that. Okay? So you can come. I don't know where everybody is, like I was in the church, but I was not a believer, okay, when I was younger. For the Bible open person, that's someone who basically has been exposed to the Bible. Maybe they no longer believe it. They used to turn to it for comfort and guidance, but they become disengaged, either through anger, emotionals, avoidance, whatever it may be. And most of the time, those who come from this usually see the Bible as just a set of morals. And unfortunately, we present that to the world a lot. Yes, there is a moral aspect to Christianity. But the Bible is a story of good news about an invitation to have the relationship you need, a relationship between you and God. But it's not just a relationship. It's an act that he has performed so that you can be pure before him. Okay? And then, of course, for the Bible closed person, I always love the Bible closed people, and I love talking to atheists who say they're open-minded, but as soon as you prod the open-mindedness, it seems to be closed pretty quick. Not everybody. Again, I'm painting with a broad brush. People have rejected religious affiliation altogether. Whether simply spiritual or decidedly atheistic, they have no interest in the Bible. Not telling you to make it the source of your life. We're not asking you to believe everything it says, but what we are asking you to do is that you pick it up. If you are as open-minded as you say, and if you are truly trying to find the truth, you really need to prod and look. So truth, what is it? Truth matters eternally. Whether the atheist is correct, whether the Christian, the Muslim, the Buddhist, you name it. Okay? Because like gravity, it doesn't matter. If Christianity doesn't intersect with the world as it truly is, it doesn't matter that you believe it. If it's wrong, Paul even says this. Okay? And you need to test that. I believe it is. If Christianity is true to reality, as I believe it truly is, what do you do with the actual guilt and anxiety you have? Christianity is the only worldview where the creator of all things has solved the problem for you. And then he asks you to trust him. I love this from Martin Luther, and this comes from his Galatians commentary. The one I'm using is a translation from a app that I use called Pray Daily, because the one from his works that I have, a lot of the words aren't used much anymore, and so it'd be a little more confusing. But he says, grace and peace. These 2 words embrace the whole of Christianity. Think about our world today. Think about what it needs most desperately. Okay? Grace and peace. Grace forgives sins and peace stills the conscience. Think about anxiety. The 2 devils who plague us are sin and conscience. The power of the law and the sting of sin has conquered these 2 monsters and trodden them underfoot, both in this age and the age to come. The world does not know this, therefore it cannot teach anything sure about how to overcome sin. If you don't have a true view of reality, you can't truly solve the problems because you're leaving things out that you need for an explanation. The world doesn't have an answer to these. It says only Christians have this kind of teaching and are equipped and armed with it. Now think about arrogance and confidence. You may think he's being arrogant here, but is he being confident? You really need to decide whether or not that is, because he's speaking from a point of confidence. And are equipped and armed with it so they can overcome sin, despair, and eternal death. It is a teaching that is given only by God. It does not proceed from free will, nor was it invented by human reason or wisdom. Okay? And I truly do think, I think a lot of the times people think that Christianity or Christians don't believe it's true, because I'll show you a video in the next talk that I give, that if we truly believed it, and if we truly believe that we have the answer that everyone needs because they will be eternally separated from Christ, why aren't we telling more people? Why do we just kind of sit on it? It was interesting. There was a convict in England, and I can't remember his name right offhand. He was a serial killer. And as he was, talking to the priest, he shooed the priest away. And this is what he said to the priest. He said, if what you say or what you're glibly telling me is true, he said, and if you truly believed it, he said, I would crawl over glass to tell everybody in the world about it. So he basically was turned off to the Christian faith because no one seemed that interested that they knew as Christians. If this is the cure to everything, why aren't you telling people? Okay? So that is kind of the reason why I get so excited when we do this class and we get ready for this trip. Because I don't want you guys to be in the same position I was in. I went through a lot of stuff that God is now using for his benefit and his glory. Now, he didn't cause me to do it. It was my own sinfulness that did it. But he's able to use that. I don't want any of you to go through what I went through. There are answers out there. You need to learn to think. You need to learn to develop. It's going to be hard work, but it's worth it. Because as you can see, our world is changing. Christianity is becoming more biased against, persecuted. Last year, there were 21,000 attested Christians that died for their faith. Okay? If it comes to the point where you are at the point or the end of a gun, I don't know if you weren't alive yet, but in Columbine, one of the people that they killed, Cassie, they asked her, do you believe in God? She said, yes. They shot her. Okay? Not trying to scare you, but the world is a place with uncertainties. And if you're in that position, and you don't know what you believe or why you believe it, and you look at what the world says about your faith, if you're not well grounded, you may leave it. But if it's true to reality, it's the worst decision you could ever make.